budgetary moment for me was an illustration not of the contestation around the GNU, but actually of how undemocratic our budget-making process has been up until now.
We are raising VAT, we're raising the fuel levy. It's just raised the fact that we had 500 billion rand sitting in this account in the Reserve Bank.
I think that the coalition with the DA is particularly challenging. You know, the ANC is a party of liberation, and you've seen over the last year the pushback against that.
There's been so much change, and yet so little policy change. At some point, surely we need to try something different from what we've been trying. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX, and this our first installment in the series Economic Justice Matters in collaboration with the Institute for Economic Justice. On this series, we're going to be exploring questions surrounding South Africa's economy and justice. And today, I'm really excited to be joined by a blockbuster panel, both insightful and incisive. We have the head of policy in the ANC, Febe Potgieter. We've got Neil Coleman, who's a co-founder of the Institute for Economic Justice and senior policy specialist. And finally, no stranger to SMWX, we have the executive director of PARI, Sithembile Mbete. Thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Could I start with you, Febe, if I may?
You're welcome.
Because of the long titles and names, I'll proceed to first name basis for now. How do you characterize this particular moment that we find ourselves in terms of coalition politics and the opportunities and challenges that it throws up for South Africa?
Well, I suppose that the first issue is that we're 30 years into democracy, 31 years this year. It's 2 generations, if I'm correct, sociological. A generation is 15 years. And if one look at other countries, I mean, usually when you get to the 30 to 40 year point, you have to take a step back because things change so much. The world change, your national situation change. And I think that the election results last year is one of those sort of dramatic changes that we're dealing with as a country. But in addition to that, there are also quite a number of crises. The crisis of participation in election, unemployment, governance, GBV and femicide, crime. So in a sense, we are at a moment, and the fact that we're doing it under coalition government at national level and then in 2 of the, I suppose, KZN, in a sense makes it more difficult, but at the same time also provides different opportunities.
Neil, in terms of where we stand economically, there are some who think that this moment is just too many voices and possibly incoherent. Others who think that this moment of political competition opens opportunities for accountability and even change. What are your thoughts?
I think both are actually true. I think that the multiplicity of voices and solutions in the country is not necessarily a good thing. We need a coherent direction. We need a vision. We need particularly the constituencies who are most affected by the crises that Febe was talking about and the economic crises to have a control of an agenda that actually materially addresses their realities. A famous African revolutionary, Cabral, said that people aren't fighting for the ideas in anybody's head. They're fighting for material improvement in their lives and their children's lives. And I think that's the test. And to the extent that the fragmentation and political competition, etc., forces parties and actors to focus their minds and think seriously both about their future, their existential survival, as well as their constituencies, the very real crises and challenges that they're experiencing. To the extent it forces them to do that, it's a positive thing. And I always think of President Lula in Brazil. He managed to drive a program of transformation, even though he had something like 20 to 25% of the parliament under the PT, the Workers' Party. But there was such a clear agenda that was driven there, yet us with an overwhelming majority government was not able to do that. We need to ask hard questions as to why that is. So I think, yes, there are positives that have come out of this period, and hopefully it's going to focus the country on the extent of the challenges and what needs to be done.
Steph, your thoughts on the threats and opportunities in this moment?
Look, I think one of the things to understand about this moment, and sort of building on both what Febe has said and what Neil has said, is that it is an inevitability. It is built into our electoral system. Proportional representation electoral systems, whether they're mixed systems or whether they're, pure PR like we have with independents, shoved in, lead to coalition governments. Because if you live in a country where no party has or commands the support of over 50% of the electorate, and you have an electoral system that divides representation in parliament proportionally, not on a winner-takes-all to the person that gets the highest number of votes, then you are going to get a result where your parliaments are going to be hung parliaments, so where there won't be any party with more than 50% of the seats. But then as a consequence of that, where your governing arrangements in those legislatures, so in our National Assembly, in the provincial legislatures, the two that were hung, where the governing arrangements need to be shared amongst a number of parties, or for one party to choose to form a minority government. This is an expected conclusion of our electoral system, that it took us 30 years to get here, is as much a result of it's a number of history, political culture, many things. But, we were always expected to get here at some point. And I think that the valuable thing about that happening at national level is that it then is forcing political parties to adjust their political cultures. Because we've had our political parties, whether they were the dominant party, which is the ANC, or anyone contesting the ANC's party, the ANC amongst opposition parties, were all contesting as if they were running in a winner-takes-all election system. So we had parties running on agendas that were very fixed, and where the way that political parties and politicians spoke about each other, went to the electorate, was in these very fixed, uncompromising ways. And you just can't do that if you are in an electoral system that is likely to yield a coalition government. And so I think that the first thing that this is good for at national level is to start shifting the political culture of our politicians and of our parties towards collaboration, towards looking, what's the one thing we agree on? Because the reason why Lula and the Mbete could have such a clear agenda is that they could define something that a large number of parties could agree with, and then you agree then not to fight about the stuff that you disagree with or you disagree about. And so, the chaos that we've seen at local level, I think, was because with the coalition governments, I think, was because there was no sort of authority. Often we treat our system hierarchically, even though it's not supposed to be like that. And so I think that with a coalition government at national level, it provides an opportunity for more senior politicians to set an agenda, a way of doing things that then can filter down to lower levels.
Yeah.
By all means, sorry to judge. I think that part of the challenge that we, however, face with coalition government, and I think that we will have to very quickly move towards a sense of maturity around how we go about with coalition government, is the approach which you particularly find at local government level, but now tend to translate to some degree in national and provincial level as well, is there is not necessarily that single issue that bring you together. So what it is a divvying up of different positions, and each party runs their portfolio. I think that's the problem with what happened with Johannesburg after 2016. if you look at, Tshwane seem to be able to get it right now, that, the focus of the mayor and the MECs are on how do we deliver services and how do we get it right. So I think that we will have to, and this is what the summit that was held about 2 years ago about finding some kind of framework for coalitions really said, that we do need to have a sense of if parties go into a coalition, they need to be transparent about what are the binding issues that they work for, so that the electorate can keep them accountable. At the moment, it's very fluid.
Can I ask Neil on this, because the conversation's moved to an interesting point where we're talking about what issues might a coalition congeal around. And for me, the interesting question is, what could that issue be, or what could those issues be in that moment? It seems as if we're still trying to search, as you say, for something that brings different parties together. There's an opportunity, if someone can articulate that correctly, that we could actually get important policy change in the direction of justice.
I think, again, there's collaboration and contestation. So there's some issues where you're going to get parties unifying around, and there's some issues where there are interests, there are deep interests, which are not going to allow, we can't have a sort of superficial sort of consensus. We're now looking at this national dialogue, and the reality is there's some very hard nuts to crack. There's some fundamental questions, particularly in relation to economic policy. And you look at the ANC's collapse in the last election, that is the product of 30 years of wrong economic policy choices, which have resulted in the situation that we confront now of deepening inequality, poverty, and unemployment. And the elephant in the room is that there were certain areas of policy that were taboo, that no parties actually were prepared to really confront, because they were regarded as the preserve, in this case, of your national treasury. And therefore, it's only with this budget this year that has now exploded out into the open. For the first time, you've had real public engagement, looking at what are our revenue-raising options? What does progressive tax mean? What are the alternatives to what Treasury is putting on the table? Do austerity budgets actually achieve their objective? And we had the Minister of Finance coming out and saying, listen, we've had years and years of austerity, but our debt to GDP ratio keeps on rising because our GDP is stagnating. We don't have growth in our economy, plus we have very unequal growth. So those very big economic questions are not ones on which a number of political parties have engaged or have serious answers. In fact, it's been more civil society organizations, for example, my institute, the Institute for Economic Justice, the Budget Justice Coalition, and others have tried to put a number of critical questions on the table. The role of the Reserve Bank and monetary policy. Very often these things are seen as too abstract and theoretical, and people don't understand how it touches their lives. But when you raise the cost of investment, that means that businesses can't afford to invest and create jobs. Now, that's a policy issue. When you contract the budget, it means your state, which is a critical actor in the economy, cannot drive growth and employment, particularly in depressed communities. That's a critical policy question. And political parties have not until now really grasped the nettle of these issues. And I think what's been very good in this coalition government is that for the first time with this budget crisis, you've had parties that are in the government of national unity and parties outside of the government of national unity who have taken this very seriously for the first time. And we've seen clearly that there are different agendas, but at least then the public can judge. Is the DA, when they're calling for cutting of spending, are they promoting an austerity agenda? And whose interests are they representing? When a fuel levy is proposed or a VAT increase is proposed, are people thinking about the impact that this is having? When the EFF takes up a whole lot of alternative revenue-raising proposals, it's for the first time putting in the public domain that there are many alternatives to mobilize domestic resources. Now, these are all critically important questions, and I think even if parties aren't united around them, at least the electorate can now make some, well-considered decisions about whose interests parties serve and how we should be taking these issues forward.
Yeah, how do you respond to that? Because this budget moment is an interesting illustration of a lot of this contestation and opportunity we've been speaking about still.
Yes, and I think that the budgetary moment for me was an illustration not of the contestation around the GNU, but actually of how undemocratic our budget-making process has been up until now, even when the ANC was the only party that was in power, and that even within an all-ANC cabinet, there was very little consultation on the revenue sources of our budget. So the involvement of other parties in cabinet forced a conversation that had never happened before. It's not like the ANC used to do this, and then in this particular budget cycle, they discussed amongst themselves and left everybody out. We've never had an open democratic budget discussion in this country about not just expenditure, but also revenue, right, and income.
Yeah. No, I think
so this is a way, and so I think what this moment was really valuable for was saying, no, hold on. Why has it always been that whoever the finance minister is just gets to stand there and inform us all, how we're going to raise, and there be minimal debate about it.
Even in terms of our own laws.
Even in terms of our own laws. So, the Money Bills Amendment Act has been in place since I was a baby. I was an intern when that act got passed. And the same parties that are currently in the GNU didn't use that act and that power when they were in opposition.
That's right.
But let's not dwell on the past. This moment, I think, is a really important one about bringing into light the conversation about how we manage our finances as a country, because they belong to all of us.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think that the question about economic justice matters, and I think it's a very important conversation that we should have. Because in a sense, it's about fiscal policy, it's about monetary policy, but I also think it's about industrial policy. Because over the last 30 years, we focus on the social wage, and our engagement in the economy is sort of like tinkering at the edges. So yes, we have a look at maybe master plans, industrial master plans, but there's in a sense the overarching plans over the last 30 years tended to focus on macroeconomic stability, which I think that 30 years later, and with an economy that over the last 12 years have grown at, below 1%, if at that, and skyrocketing unemployment, I think that the conversation both about the budget, about fiscal policy, about what do we do about jobs and unemployment is something that has to be on the national agenda. Because if we don't do that, then we are putting in danger stability in the country. But I also think that we putting in danger the future of generations, because intergenerational poverty is getting worse. And I think Neil earlier spoke about, the fact that amongst the issues that have regressed, it's not only inequality, but it's also unemployment and poverty. So amongst the issues that the national dialogue must deal with, because, it won't be a national dialogue if it can't deal with the tough economic questions, is how do we make sure that we develop a growth path that's different from some of the fundamentals of the last 30 years. And I think that that's the importance of the moment. Absolutely. That it does provide that opportunity. And I think that in a sense the moment and including the budget crisis, and I agree with Stead that even in the ANC there's been no democratic discussion about the budget, because the budget was the preserve of the finance minister who come and brief the officials, and it gets through parliament. And I think that one of the issues that we're looking at now is exactly how do you democratize the discussions around fiscal policy, around monetary policy, So we have resolutions about it, but in the actual mechanics of how it gets implemented, it becomes a difficulty.
You know, in the late 90s, I spoke to a cabinet minister about the adoption of gear. And she said to me, no, the economic ministers were dealing with that. We didn't discuss it in cabinet. You remember Maria Ramos and Trevor Manuel said, this is a non-negotiable policy. It wasn't tabled at NEDLAC and so on. So it's partly a question of economic literacy and economic power. Who holds the power to dictate? In the run-up to this conversation, Sizwe, I looked at some of the history going back to the early 2000s, where there was a far greater generation of employment, for example. It was interesting because there was a relaxation to some degree of, you had a slightly more expansionary fiscal policy. And in other words, more was being spent by the state, and the monetary policy wasn't as tight. Interest rates weren't as high in real terms. And so what it meant was the policies that Febe's talking about, your industrial policy, your social policy, et cetera, were able to have a bit more of an impact.
Infrastructure.
Yeah, infrastructure. But even then, you know, without a much more expansionary policy, a macroeconomic policy which creates that environment in which industrial policy investment works, in which social spending in communities begins to generate the sort of multiplier. Economists talk about multipliers, which is that spending actually creates more economic activity, which generates employment and self-employment and so on. Unless your macroeconomic policy works together with those other policies, it suffocates them and it makes it impossible for them to work. And I think that's the challenge that we face now, is that the crises are so deep. This crisis that Febe was talking about of this low growth trap, combined with these other social crises, means that something radical and dramatic has to be done. High impact strategies are required in order to get the wheels of the economy turning and to create this sort of stimulus, particularly in depressed economies and industries, that is able to break that cycle. The medium-term structural transformation needs to continue. For example, the diversification of industries, some of the infrastructure things around, you know, fixing our rail and transport, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, that's all very, very important. But you need immediate high-impact measures. And I think that's one of the challenges facing us.
That is one of the challenges and opportunities, because if we can find those measures and find some kind of consensus around them, we can do something different. And for me, what has frustrated me and continues to frustrate me in this moment, although I'm open to change being possible, is that there's been so much change and yet so little policy change in the immediate aftermath of massive political change. And so I guess there's an opportunity in a way for someone to chart what the new economy could look like. It could come out of this national dialogue, it could come out of the contestation within the government, but at some point, surely we need to try something different from what we've been trying.
Well, I'm not as surprised as you are that the big political change hasn't yielded big policy change, because it's the nature of the kind of coalition that we have. You know, this coalition is at its core is a grand coalition between the two biggest parties in the system that have actually not that different policy positions on the economy, but that see themselves as very different, and then creating this supermajority coalition. The 10 GNU partners have, I think, over 70% of the seats in parliament. And for the stability of those coalitions, and you see this globally, is the way that they tend to govern is they govern on the things that they agree with and they avoid the things that they disagree with. So big policy moves, big legislative moves don't often happen under these kinds of coalitions. However, I would also argue that in South Africa, our problem isn't a big policy one necessarily. A lot of our challenges are just around not doing the things that we've been saying we were going to do for a really long time, or not having the requisite kind of debate and discussion and conversation to then say, okay, which piece of this do we start with? It's sequencing, and so that I think should be our biggest expectation from this coalition, is around actually getting some movement on things that have been on the table for years and years and years. I keep saying to people that inertia is our biggest problem, is our biggest challenge, our biggest difficulty as a country. That things, we avoid doing certain things, we avoid having certain conversations. I guess what I will say, which isn't quite a contradiction of myself, I'm an academic, it's, both sides, exactly, is that we are also in a place where there's lots of review processes, that 30 years, so we know we've got the white paper review of local government, the local government white paper being reviewed, the local government fiscal framework being reviewed, and I do think that these opportunities are really important ones for us to yield if we want to achieve economic justice. Because, for example, and I'll end here, the local government fiscal framework is not appropriate for the majority of municipalities in South Africa. When 40% of your population lives below the lower bound poverty line, municipalities can't be primarily financed on rates collections. So, the municipal system municipalities only get about 8-9% of their budget from the state. So the national budget only has about 9% set aside for local government. And the assumption is that municipalities will be able to raise their own revenue off rates or off the financial market.
Or sales of electricity.
Or sales of, rates in water and electricity. And that's just not true for the vast majority of our municipalities. And if you look at a place like Brazil, you look at places, similar countries in the world, the allocation that they give to local government from the national fiscus is far greater. And so there are these review processes at the moment that I think do allow us to have a different conversation, to try to reset the conversation. But that isn't going to be a result of new policy coming out of the GNU parties.
Sorry. Febe, you wanted to build on what Thea was saying.
Well, I think that the question about the nature of the coalition, in the nature of coalitions, it's parties that wouldn't otherwise work together, that come together. If one look at over the 30 years, the ANC have included other parties in government post the 1994 GNU. The IFP have been in government with us, Minister of Science and Technology. That was brilliant. Etc. So I think that that's the one nature of the coalition. I think that the coalition with the DA is particularly challenging, in a sense, because you have a GNU of 10 parties that are relatively small. The other parties are relatively small, 1 or 2 seats. So you do have these two major parties, as Stacey said. But at the same time, there are also fundamental differences. The ANC is a party of liberation. Our objective is that fundamentally what we are about is addressing that legacy of apartheid colonialism and patriarchy. And you've seen over the last year the pushback against that, from the expropriation bill to whether you can exclude kids because they don't speak the language that your school teach, to in Bella, to issues around black economic empowerment that's being debated now.
NHI as well.
Even especially the NHI as well, yes. Including the issues about if you have an agricultural policy, yes, you want to open markets for farmers in China, but you can't look at it as if all farmers have the same opportunities, that you have to look at through the lens that how do you also build up opportunities for small-scale farmers, which the majority are black or women. So around those issues, there are very serious differences. And I think that part of what the big interventions will have to be is a recognition that inequality is a problem in the country, that unemployment is a problem in the country, and poverty is a problem in this country, and that fundamentally to what we all do as South Africans, not just political parties, is going to have to be how do we tackle these three fundamental issues. And this is why it's so unfortunate, this 10% that unemployment is only 10% debate that's going on. It is really, really annoying because I think that in a sense, yes, we need to look at our statistics and there's a debate about it, but at the same time, we can't undermine the impact of poverty, unemployment on young people, and on communities.
I do want to challenge that though, because I think that the 10% story, and whether it's 10% or whatever, what I think that the fundamental thing is that the way that our expectations of what employment is, what gainful livelihood making is, are constructed out of a context that doesn't match the reality of South Africa. So if you've got a large part of the population that is needing to hustle, to do whatever they do in order to make money, the problem of not including those people or thinking of people like that as employed is that you shut them out of the finance system.
That's not the situation. The statistics very clearly capture, if you look at the questions that they ask in the quarterly labour force survey, actually they over-capture the employed. They exaggerate the number of people who are employed, including self-employed, including informally employed.
You have to work for 1 hour
work for
a
1
week.
hour in the previous week. If you work for your family and you don't earn any money, nothing, you're regarded as employed in terms of our surveys. So I think the discussion about whether, we should be looking at a different type of approach to economic activity. For example, the Institute has spoken strongly about the need for basic income to provide a stimulus in poor communities to generate all types of economic activity, not just formal economic activity. That's a different question. But I think a denialism where there's sectors of the elite who want to deny the extent of the problem because then it makes them feel much better about the situation. And they say, well, there would have been massive unrest. Where were they in July 2021? Those were food riots. There was a political dimension to them, but they were food riots. So I think we must be very careful about that. And, I agree, but sorry, Febe.
Yeah. But it's there's a difference in conversation.
To respond, because she was finishing. Okay. How do you respond to this response to your point? And then we'll come back. And this is going to be very good for our views.
I think so.
And my point is not about the CEO with the 10%, the methodology. My point is that we do need to have conversations about are all the structures that we have around finance, around all of these methodologies, around our financial systems, around access to all sorts of services, are they appropriate for the country that we are? Not the country that we wish we were, or not the country that we were 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So to the extent that this whole unemployment gate has allowed for, or is opening up a question, a conversation about these things, about what is it that we need to readjust in the present for the country that we actually are, not the country that we wished we were when when democracy started in 1990.
Okay. But I think it's the wrong conversation. I think that there are two conversations. The one conversation is the conversation about whether somebody that work for 1 hour a week and hustle, as you say, who are counted at the moment in our unemployment figures. I mean, and I remember the debate when Stats South Africa changed around 2008. There was a debate about whether, there were people that were saying 1 hour a week is ridiculous. But anyway, that's the statistics that we have at the moment. So I think that on the one hand, there's that process of that statistical methodology, the conversation about what we need to do to make sure that people have sustainable livelihoods is a different conversation. But the problem with this denialism, and I agree with you, it's a form of denialism, is that it says that, okay, it's not so bad. It's not a crisis. And I think that it's just going in the wrong direction. We must accept that we've got an unemployment crisis, that we've got a growth crisis, that we have a poverty crisis, and therefore, what do we need to do to be able to address those issues? And then we can look at what do we then need to do if there are new avenues that open up in terms of how we, count informal settlements or sponsorship, informal business or sponsorship.
Digital work.
Yes,
Gigging that maybe doesn't conform to normal unemployment or employment.
But when you ask whether you've worked over the last week, I mean, you will say that I've worked 4 hours on my program. Your digital...
Yeah. Maybe. Neil, how do you wrap up this employment question?
Again, coming back to President Lula, sorry to make him the reference point, but when he spoke to the COSATU executive a couple of decades ago, he said, when we put money into working people and poor people's hands, it got the giant wheel of the Brazilian economy moving. And I think that's the issue, is that the lack of economic stimulus and demand and the depression in our poorest communities means that there isn't the basis for those economic activities that Sithembile is talking about. When we compare ourselves to Mexico or a range of other countries, academics have looked at this and show that the size of our informal sector is very small compared to those societies because of the apartheid legacy, of the denial of opportunities to the majority in the country, because of the Bantustan system where people were dumped way out of the cities. And now all of this is being exacerbated by the high cost of capital, the monopolization or the concentration of our economy, the fact that people can't compete against the large retailers, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all structural questions that need to be dealt with. And so I think it comes back to the issue of what is the platform that is required in order to galvanize society, coming back to the national dialogue and so on and so forth. Very sad for me, looking as a UDF activist from the 1980s, when we had this very political cohesion in society, movement. Our society is very political. The fact that the people are alienated from politics is a political statement. They're refusing to vote because they're refusing to accept what is being dished out to them by the political parties. That in itself is I still believe that we have a society that is quite conscious and that can be engaged on the critical issues. So the question is, how do we mobilize a critical mass of these forces? Yes, the trade union movement is weakened. Yes, civil society is weakened. There's disillusionment. But I think it is possible to galvanize people if you're putting the sort of issues on the table which really speak to them, which really speak to the daily experience. And the daily experience is that one in every 5 families is sending someone out to beg for food on a regular basis. That is the reality.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And I will come back to you,
sure.
Febe, but just to give you a chance, stay as well on this question of coalition building, which is something that Febe has alluded to. There's the formal executive coalition at the national level, but ultimately driving forward economic reforms which touch on these issues that Neil has raised is going to require society-wide coalition building. And we're used to that. In the 80s, we had a coalition. It wasn't a formal government coalition.
A front.
Sure, a front.
Yes.
Yeah.
But a unity of different voices and different interests. And perhaps in this moment, we also need to think beyond the political moment, the formal political moment, to a broader social moment.
Yes, and I think it's very critical because of how few people are participating in the formal politics, right? Of the 40 million or so eligible voters last year, only 16 million turned out. It's about 40%. And the people who did not participate in the election were particularly younger people,
That's right.
under the age of 40. So around 70% of South Africans are under the age of 40, and just under less than 50% of eligible voters under 40 participated in the election. For the first time ever, voter turnout was highest amongst registered voters in the demographic 70 to 79.
Yeah.
Over 80% of voters, registered voters, aged 70 to 79, actually voted, compared to 45% of 18 to 19-year-olds.
Viva the pensioners.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Gee, wow.
And so,
May they live long.
and so there's this huge chunk of the population that's just boycotted the system.
And it's less, the younger you get,
And
the
it's,
less and less.
yes,
And less it is.
and so one of the things that's going to make our voter turnout decrease over time is that the voters' roll is aging.
Yeah.
So fewer and fewer young people are actually registering to vote in the first place, and then actually then have the opportunity to vote on voting day. And so when you've got so few people who actually made the formal political choice to put in place the national executive, then you do need to think about why are they not participating in the system, and where are they? How are they organizing, and how do we bring them into firstly, how do we go to where they are? Actually, at this point, I think that it's not even about how do you bring them into the system, but how do you go to where the majority of South Africans are and actually find out their views and what they want this country to look like in a situation where there's none of the big political parties, or none of the political parties that we have, are attracting people to come in and to actually be involved in the system. And the other big concerning thing is, in a country where over 40% of households fall below the lower bound poverty line, research that has been done, and there hasn't been sufficient research done on this, but what the sense that we're getting is that if you look at ward level, it's people in the poorest wards that aren't turning out to vote.
Yeah.
So South Africa was unique amongst democracies for the first 15 years, where you had poor working class people voting at a higher rate than middle class and wealthy people. That has now reversed.
Because people feel their issues aren't being addressed.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's reversed. And so we have a system, basically, where there was all of the stuff last year about, okay, South Africa's democracy is now consolidated, the ANC lost, got below 50%, lost an election. And, the stuff that we teach first years, you and I, is about, democracy consolidates when there's the first sort of change in power. Yeah. And so South Africa's democracy is consolidated, but that consolidation has come at the expense of the political participation of the poorest and the most marginalized.
Yeah, and
so
young people.
Any coalition building or any idea of a national dialogue needs to put, reaching those people at the center if it's going to mean anything.
Yeah. And it's a very limiting lens.
I think that's the issue. I think that stays right. The figures about who didn't vote last year, because I think that last year represented, in a sense, that crisis. If you look at the figure, the number of young people who are not registered is about under 35, 9.6 million people. That's not registered, so it's a huge amount of people that are not registered. And in the conversation about young people, one of the issues that some of the young activists say is that the problem is not that we're not politically engaged. They say we're just not interested in being engaged in the spaces where we expected to, engage in. We have other ways of and forums and platforms of engagement, whether it's digital, whether it's issue-based movements, and so forth. So I think that the conversation about the national dialogue and how do you bring different sectors of society into the conversation about the economic justice, about the issues of what constitute participation and democracy and citizenship is an important part of that process, because the strength of a structure like the UDF in the 1980s was that it brought together civics, big constituencies, but also the smallest little NGO or advice office in some rural area. But it also allowed for constituencies to organize. And I think that in South Africa today, we haven't lost all of that. I mean, if you look at, for example, the HIV/AIDS movement, SANEC, the amount of organizations that form part of it, and one of the colleagues that work on SANEC made the example yesterday in a conversation about the national dialogue that, he went to a meeting organized by SANEC in KZN, and he said it was packed with, local villagers and traditional leaders and women, etc. Another conversation about somebody working in the SMME sector that said, for the national dialogue, we've got thousands and thousands of stokvels on our database. They're all very active and they're very organized, mainly women. So that's a constituency that we do. So I think that there's a lot of social capital that we have in the country. And I think that the obsession with political parties in some sense is sort of like that everything is going to be solved by government and by political parties. I think that one of the lessons that we need to come back to 30 years later is that all of society need to be part of the solutions, but also the implementation of those solutions.
Can I, Neil, bring you in here and allow you to respond to what's been said? And then also, because we're now running out of time, ask you all to think about the future and a final call to action based on the conversation we've had. But Neil, please, how do you respond to what's been said? We're talking coalitions and building across society.
I agree with Sithembile and Febe that it's a very limiting lens to only look at who's voting, what political participation there is. We've got to look at much broader forms of political participation and why people aren't, attracted to participate in the electoral process. And the answer is going to lie in broader social society-wide processes. And I think that's what Febe has been saying very powerfully. But the issue is, why is there such cynicism around the national dialogue? People are very cynical about it. And I must say, having been involved in a number of job summits and so on, I share the concerns. I think they're legitimate. That if the real core issues, this comes back to the question of economic justice that we were discussing. If those issues that are being decided in smoke-filled rooms in Treasury, around where resources are allocated, around how budgets are determined, around the Reserve Bank determining, interest rates and things that have a massive effect on people's lives, then people are going to see something like this national dialogue as another talk shop. And that comes to your question of what needs to be done. What needs to be done. We said earlier that we need some high impact interventions. We've got a massive one of the battles and one of the society coalitions that, we were talking about is the Universal Basic Income Coalition, which is looking at the introduction of basic income, as people know, to provide a floor to ensure that nobody is in a situation where they have no access to income, that the level of hunger and starvation in the society is a scandal which should not be tolerated.
Absolutely.
But it's not just a developmental or rather a social development intervention or social welfare intervention. It's an economic intervention. And the point is, while it's not a golden bullet or a silver bullet, what it does is it injects income into very depressed communities. And we've seen that with the social relief of distress grant, which is now being attacked by Treasury and vested interests in society who want to see resources being directed elsewhere. So the question is, Sizwe, what are the high impact interventions that we can bring about? And we use, in the IEJ, we use a sort of nice 3-word slogan. It says, stabilize, stabilize communities and industries that are suffering, that have been hard hit. Secondly, stimulate economic activity. And thirdly, structurally transform. So you can do those things. We've got to be able to do more than one thing at a time. And the people cannot wait for some of the long-term solutions, but those solutions have to start being put in place in the meantime. But the high-impact interventions relate to, do you save a particular sector where thousands of jobs are at stake? Do you use your policy tools that you have available, whether they're tariffs, whether they're investments by the state, whether this is, around the introduction of social support measures. So there are a range of interventions that can have a massive impact. And one of the advantages actually of being at a very low level, economically, is that your interventions have a higher impact because you see the results of them immediately. And some of the dogma, some of the refusal to consider creative alternatives. So, for example, the Institute for Economic Justice raised the fact that we had 500 billion rand sitting in this account in the Reserve Bank, the JFECRA, and we were told, no, you can't touch that, you can't touch it. We insisted, raised the issue, researched it, presented the evidence. Now 150 billion has been made available from that. But the scandal is that there's still over 300 billion rand sitting in that account that is owed to National Treasury, which is not being used. And we are raising VAT, we're raising the fuel levy because we are told we don't have any resources. The Public Investment Corporation has just passed the 3 trillion mark. It has 3 trillion in assets. Why are we not mobilizing those assets? So there are a range of alternatives which exist to mobilize domestic resources. And we need to have this serious, is the national dialogue going to be having discussions about this?
If
it is, great. If it's not, it's a waste of time in my view.
I think
final thoughts and then still round off.
I think that the point that Neil raised and stay about this moment, I think that there are opportunities. One of them is, for example, that the Finance Committee in Parliament has sent Treasury back to look at the change of the SRD towards a basic income grant, to say that you can't just say that no, it can't be done. Go back and do the figures. Because this is a manifesto, it's something that, government said it will explore. So I think that there are those kind of issues, but I also think that your national dialogue cannot not deal with the economic questions, with the land questions, with those issues that are amongst the major reasons why young people didn't vote and why poor people didn't vote. So I think that there's general agreement, and I think that civil society, political parties, academics, intellectuals, all of us will have to push, the media, all of us will have to push that the national dialogue, if it doesn't deal with the economic questions, then it would fail. Because at the end of the day, the challenges that we face, yes, there's a democratic deficit, but as you said earlier with your quote about, is it Cabral?
Yeah. That
it is for people about their material well-being, that the lives of their children will be better than theirs.
Yeah. Esther?
So, 3 things. One, I fully agree that you need a national dialogue that's fully inclusive. Unfortunately, what we've seen with the announcement of the eminent persons group, and then, all the numbers going about how much it's going to cost, and is that the way that this process has been announced to the public hasn't been very confidence building. And so a lot of work needs to be done to actually show that this will be an inclusive process, a transparent one around the way that decisions are being made and resources are being spent. And that it will include the people that most need to be included, who will be the ones who will be alive in 30 years. If you look at that eminent persons group, there's not many of them. And so there's a big thing that needs to be done around building trust and confidence into this process as one that will be worth being involved in for ordinary South Africans. But a second thing, I think that the opportunity, and something that we haven't discussed today in much detail, is the opportunities around the operating of the state and the public administration that come from this GNU. That part of having, political power fragmented is that it does, to some degree, mean that some of the old sort of patterns of patronage and lines of, things just aren't there anymore because certain political actors don't, it's been disrupted. And I think that's a good thing. But the big question then is, how do we build a capable developmental state out of this moment? And that's a lot of the work that PARI does about how do you then build the right kind of stable administration, because we are going to have coalition governments well into the future because our electoral system is designed for it, and constitutionally so. And the coalition government, the countries that have coalitions, where those coalitions are not big disruptions, are countries where an administration is able to continue running. Regardless of who is in power, and you don't have services completely collapse, as we've seen in many of our local government municipalities. And so we really need to think about that. And I think that is an exciting opportunity that the GNU or that coalition government brings. And then a third thing is that I do think that we need to expand, and I take everything that Neil has said and that Febe said around the discussions that need to happen around economic policy. But I think that we also need to think around how all of our different areas of policy work together for improving the lives of ordinary people. So recent research that we've done at PARI around the affordability of basic services, and that a kiloliter of water, a kilowatt of electricity are unaffordable for the lowest 40% of households in this country. So they need to have access to free basic services, but the allocation of free basic services that households get is not developmental. It's just to keep the lights on. So you've got households daily making choices between, do I buy food or do I buy electricity? And that is not a way, that's not developmental at all. So while we're having the conversation about the basic income grant, about the grant, while we're having the conversation about, extending or developing the different revenue sources for the fiscus, let's also have a conversation about the policies that we've got around the broad social wage, and do they actually work the way that they're supposed to? And so I think that we're in an interesting moment of reset and review. And we can't afford to squander this moment because global politics are showing us that we really are on our own. And so there is a need to have open conversations non-defensively in order to really take South Africa forward in a way that is just for everyone that lives here.
Can I just,
since you've convened us here, of course you can have a last word.
Look, I think the one thing is we mustn't be too modest in our ambitions. We must be ambitious. We must be bold.
I heard this thing the other day. Sorry, you must have a BSAG, a big, scary, audacious goal.
Great.
Always moving towards. And we don't have that.
Great. And we're talking about the international situation. We're in a mess now. The international situation, ever since I've been in the democratic movement forever, we've been told that it's not.
Let's just say you probably vote.
It's part of the voting demographic.
We're told it's not possible. In 1995, we were told, globalization doesn't allow us to have a developmental state. And then we were told in 2008, with the global financial crisis, you can't do this and this. And then with COVID, we were told you can't do this. And now we're being told that there's this international economic crisis. But we've got to look at history and show and see how countries have, out of the ruins of war or out of the ruins of the Great Depression, you've had, the Marshall Plan in Europe. You've had the New Deal in the US. But in developing countries, you've had, the Asian tigers rising up from being these basket cases economically because they had the boldness and the preparedness to take on, orthodoxies and to take on taboo areas. And I think this is what we've got to start doing as South Africans. We've got to be prepared to say, look, we can't actually settle for this,
tinkering.
The tinkering, this low growth trap, this situation in which the majority of people are marginalized and excluded. So yes, if we're going to go that route, I think, with the boldness of vision, but then we have to mobilize society around that. We have to mobilize social forces to give the politicians no alternative but to embark on that type of program, which is going to deliver that sort of transformation. I think that's a challenge.
Neil, Sithembile, Febe, thank you so much for really riveting. If this is any model for the national dialogue, then I think it might be worthwhile. And thank you so much for joining us for this important first installment of Economic Justice Matters. Comment down below. Tell us whether you agree, disagree, what your thoughts are for the economic future of South Africa, how we secure economic justice in the immediate term, the medium term, and the long term. And also on social media, feel free to tag me, tag our guests, so we can also take the conversation there and we'll amplify you there. Stay tuned for further installments. I think Sithembile alluded to an important point about the international climate, which we didn't get to, which maybe we'll touch on in further episodes. And keep it locked on SMWX. Aye.
Na na na